Ambassador Odembo, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Before we talk about Kenya, I'd like to ask you about Africa's place in global business. What business opportunities does Africa offer, and why do so many companies overlook them?
Thank you very much for your question. A good question, an important question, I think, for the entire international business community. The fact of the matter is, at the moment, we contribute very little, about 1.5% to the global trade. So for that reason, it appears to most investors and most business people that Africa isn't particularly active in terms of business and trade. On the other side of that is the fact that Africa is the continent that so all roads will be leading to, because of some of the things that are happening in Africa at the moment. A rising middle class. We are developing. African governments are investing heavily in infrastructure. We are also in a situation where we hold on the continent riches and commodities that the world economy values and the world economy requires in order to keep growing the world economy. And so we are hoping that with all the riches and the resources that we have and the commodities that we know are precious to the world, and that the world is beginning to turn its head towards Africa, we want to position ourselves and make sure that we are ready to do business with the rest of the world and grow that percentage from 1.5% to 10% in the very near future, because we think we have a lot to offer to the continent. And the fact of the matter is that those who are investing, who are currently on the continent, are doing very well.
That's great. If you were to look from the perspective of somebody outside the region, just looking outside into Africa, how would you segment the African market? What are the regions that are most promising in terms of investment?
I think in terms of investment, I would, of course, favor East Africa, because that's where Kenya is located. But you also must appreciate the fact that the continent is beginning to think collectively. And so we are looking at Africa as an investment destination and as a trading bloc. And as such, what the continent has done, and the African Union, with the leadership of the African Union, we have segmented the continent into various regional economic blocs. By and large, the regional economic blocs are beginning to do very well. Some of them are fairly young. The East African regional bloc, for example, with a population of about 150 million, that's Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi, offers a significant opportunity because we have a customs protocol at the moment that has increased quite significantly the trade between the countries. A few months ago, we signed, the 5 countries in the region signed a free market and free trade protocol, which now enables us to move goods, services, and people across the boundaries without any hitches. We are investing heavily in the infrastructure within the region, with major roads and corridors coming from the port on the Indian Ocean, going all the way into southern Sudan, going all the way into Ethiopia, going all the way into Rwanda and Burundi, and to eastern DRC. So I see tremendous opportunities within the East African region, but the South African Development Community as well, SADC, is also doing equally well in terms of building regional infrastructure and increasing trade and opening up the region as a whole, so that if you are doing business in one country, you have access to the rest of the region as well. There's also the common market for East and Southern Africa, of which Kenya is a member and a leading player within that. And so again, by setting shop and doing business with Kenya, you have not just the possibility of the East African community, this population of 150 or so million. You have the population of the East and Southern African countries, some 18 or so countries, the population of 400 million. Kenyan business people are already investing quite heavily because there is a market in that East and Southern African region. So I would say prospects are very good in the East African region.
When we talk about investment, we usually refer to opportunities, but we also have to consider risks.
That's right.
What would you regard as the principal risks of doing business in Africa that international investors should be aware of, and how can they protect themselves against those risks?
There has been, for a long time, this perception that, granted, there are risks, and any business person going to do business anywhere outside the environment in which they are comfortable, outside of the environment in which they're familiar, will be subjected to some element of risk regardless. So there is no place where you go and invest and there is no element of risk. The kinds of risks that businesses and investors have had to deal with on the continent are related to, for example, civil wars that we have seen come and go. We have had risks related to unreliable judiciary processes and recourses in court, so that if you had some if you had issues that pertain to business contracts and so forth, that the recourse in courts was not readily and easily available, the court procedures taking too long. But we have a situation where, again, if you look at the continent in the last few years, very few places where there are civil wars compared to 10 years ago, where at any given time there was an average of about 10 countries, African countries. And every time there's a war in any given country, again, the mindset about the continent is that, if there's war in one country, there are some people who imagine there's war all over the continent. And that's just a geography lesson issue that needs to be sorted out, that these are 53 different countries, and that when something is happening in one country, so I think, and if you look at what has happened in the last few years in terms of improved governance, all the countries are becoming more democratic, they're having elections more regularly, so the sort of typical tensions that would result in risk-causing situations, those have been minimized to a great extent. Wars around the time of elections, civil wars between different communities in a country, fighting over natural resources between one community and another. I think, by and large, we've overcome to a great extent those kinds of challenges, and the continent is looking ahead to just being a continent where there's a certain amount of predictability, because that was the other risk. Business people like to know that there's a certain amount of predictability in different ways. So I think we now have all the ingredients that minimize all those risks that people feared before. And one of the ways to establish that is for a prospective business person, investor, to talk to some company that is already doing business on the continent, has been doing business over a period of time. And they would be able to tell you the kinds of changes that have taken place over the last 10 years, 5 years particularly, and how much we have managed now as countries and as regions to minimize risks to investors, because we all appreciate now that we've been left behind, and therefore we must do what is necessary to create an enabling environment for the private sector and business and investment, both local and foreign direct investment as well.
It's quite likely that these days, if we were to pick a company that has been investing in China, in Africa, it would quite likely be from China.
Yes.
As we all know, our China, this is an issue our Chinese edition has been following closely, is the volume of Chinese investment in Africa.
Yes.
Could you help us understand how you view China's investment strategy in Africa and what it means for investors from other parts of the world?
Good question. I don't know if I can talk too much to the Chinese investment strategy, because I'm not privy to the Chinese investment strategy.
But at least as it appears to you.
From my observation, from what I see, in the last few years, the Chinese, when they first came into the continent, noticeably about 10 years ago, a lot of African countries were very uneasy with the nature and the manner in which they were coming in and setting up businesses and the types of investments that we're making. I think the Chinese have become much more sophisticated in the last 10 years, and I believe that they now actually do have a strategy. Again, I do not have it. I don't know if they'll make it available to anybody. But the fact of the matter is there appears to be some strategy, and it evolves around what they have studied the continent extremely well. They know what the demographics are. There is a rising middle class on the continent. There's a very dynamic young population. The continent is becoming increasingly urbanized, and therefore there is a market and purchasing power on the continent. So that's one. So I think one part of the Chinese strategy is based on the fact that they are reading Africa very well in terms of where we are now and where we are likely to go to in the next few years. The second element of it is that the Chinese also appreciate the riches that the continent has. Most other countries have known the kinds of riches that exist there. Some foreign countries, northern countries, North America, Europe, have tended to extract from the continent those commodities and those valuable minerals, metals that they needed in order to grow and develop their industries. The Chinese, I think, have figured out that over the next 10 or so years, some of the most valuable commodities that the global economy requires are on the continent. So I think the Chinese are positioning themselves and looking to do business with African countries. The Chinese have figured out that in another 10 years, the continent will have a population of 1 billion people. That's a very sizable market. That's a sizable market for selling your products, sizable market for setting up and not to mention the human resource capability that exists there for producing goods that you might want to import into your own country. So again, I'm not sure what the strategy is, but I can look and imagine that there are things that they're seeing there that obviously are going to put them in a very good position in terms of who will benefit.
And what implications do you think this will have for investors from other parts of the world?
It's a challenge. I mean, investors are going to have to compete with somebody who already has a foot in the door, an investor who is investing heavily in developing infrastructure, which is where African governments will tell you that's where the greatest need has been. Infrastructure. And if that's where the Chinese are putting the emphasis, and a good part of this infrastructure is about opening up the continent. And so you will be able to, you're in a situation where if you are part of what is going to be going on in the continent in the next 10 years or so, and if this infrastructure has been developed, Africa is going to be able to trade within itself quite significantly. And we've learned this just in the last 2-3 years during the global recession and this economic crisis, when our commodities didn't have a ready market because our buyers, our traditional markets, were experiencing the crisis. So we turned inward and started trading with each other. So the potential for trading within the continent with this developed infrastructure, clearly the person who is investing in the infrastructure themselves will stand to benefit very significantly because they will know the infrastructure very well, and part of just being a good business person and investor is knowing how the infrastructure is set up and how things move from point A to point B. So